During the graduation ceremony at Fort Braxton, everything was in perfect alignment. The soldiers, 200 of them, stood proudly, faces forward, their backs straight as the anthem began to play. It was a moment of unity, a symbol of military honor. But as the national anthem blared over the speakers, one figure remained still. Amidst the sea of uniforms, Sarah, dressed in simple civilian attire, stood motionless, her eyes locked forward, unwavering. She didn't salute. The sudden contrast was palpable. 200 pairs of eyes flicked toward her, then back to the front. Unsure whether they had seen what they thought they had, the collective breath of the crowd seemed to freeze, and whispers began to spread like wildfire. The commanding officer's jaw tightened. A subtle but clear sign of frustration passed through his features. Security moved into position, 3 men in uniform stepping forward in unison, boots echoing sharply across the stone floor. Yet, Sarah didn't flinch. Not even a glance shifted. Her stillness was defiant, a silent refusal to conform to what everyone else did automatically. The weight of her decision hung heavy in the air, thickening the atmosphere like fog. The commanding officer looked at her, his expression unreadable. The tension was growing, feeding off the confusion, feeding off the pressure. "Is she insane?" one soldier muttered under his breath. "Is she a traitor?" another whispered, eyes darting back and forth, unsure of what to do next. A few murmurs rose from the crowd, the undercurrent of judgment now undeniable. They wanted her to comply, to fall in line with tradition. But Sarah remained unmoving, as though she couldn't hear them at all. The eyes of the room were locked on her, some with judgment, others with confusion. No one could understand why she wasn't doing what everyone else was. Was she mocking them? Did she not understand the importance of the ceremony? The national anthem was supposed to evoke pride, unity, and respect. Yet here was this one woman, a stranger, not even willing to acknowledge the anthem in the same way. The unease rippled outward. The commanding officer took a step forward, his voice loud and clear as he barked orders. "Security, take her aside." His voice was clipped, but Sarah didn't move. Not a single muscle twitched in response. The growing discomfort in the room was palpable. Some soldiers stood at attention. Some looked nervously between the officer and Sarah, unsure if they should act, if they should follow orders or wait for further instructions. But she didn't move. The power of the moment was in her silence. She was standing there, locked in place, like someone with a secret that no one could comprehend. And the more she stood there, the more the room seemed to hold its breath. Who was she? Why wasn't she saluting? Why didn't she care about the ceremony? These questions swirled in the air, unanswered. Her stillness made her a mystery, and every second that ticked by seemed to compound the weight of the unknown. The more they tried to force her to react, the more resolute her stance became. Her eyes never wavered, never shifted. Even as the whispers around her grew louder, there was something about her calm demeanor that made the room feel even more suffocating. It wasn't the defiance alone, it was the certainty behind it. She wasn't confused by the situation. She wasn't questioning her choice. She had made it, and she was going to stand by it. And with every passing moment, it became clearer Sarah wasn't going to break. Not under the pressure of a crowd, not under the authority of the commanding officer, not under the weight of the ceremony. This moment was bigger than her. It wasn't about disrespect, it wasn't even about protest. It was something deeper, something that would take time to reveal, a complexity that no one in the room could yet understand. The tension in the room thickened, the whispers grew louder, but Sarah stood alone, immovable. Sarah Mitchell blended effortlessly into the crowd at Fort Braxton, a place where every soldier, contractor, and civilian had their role, their place. At first glance, she seemed like any other middle-aged woman in her early 40s. Her blonde hair was neatly styled, neither fashionable nor outdated practical, like everything else about her. Her clothing was simple slacks, a plain top, and well-worn shoes. There was nothing remarkable about her appearance, nothing that screamed out of place. She wasn't trying to stand out, and she didn't. Yet, there was an undeniable aura about her that the other contractors couldn't quite place. She was the kind of woman who would be overlooked in a room full of people, but somehow, she had the ability to make everyone notice her, though they didn't know why. Each morning, Sarah arrived at the training facility exactly 15 minutes before the scheduled start time. It was always the same. Without fail, she entered the room with a quiet step, her eyes scanning the space for exits and potential hazards. She never joined the social groups that formed around coffee or during breaks. Instead, she sat alone at the farthest corner of the room, her posture impeccable, her eyes always focused. The others noticed this. They noticed her punctuality, her ability to keep to herself, and how she kept her distance from the gossiping, laughing contractors. She was present, but she was separate. No one knew much about her beyond the basics. She didn't offer much. Her presence was neutral, calm, but always just a bit too precise. The instructors didn't mention it, but some of them noticed too. There was a sharpness in the way Sarah responded to instructions, the way her movements were always deliberate, like someone who had trained to move with purpose. She picked up a rifle in a weapons handling exercise one morning, and the instructors were taken aback. She handled the M4A1 with such efficiency, so naturally, that it was clear she had done this many times before. There was no hesitation, no clumsy adjustment, as if she had never been unfamiliar with the weight, the trigger, the mechanics of the weapon. She stripped and reloaded it with the speed and precision of someone who had spent countless hours mastering the drill. She moved on to the next task, calmly checking her surroundings, without so much as a second glance. It was in the subtle details that Sarah began to stand out. A sudden sound, a door slamming, footsteps too close would trigger a reaction before anyone else had time to process it. She would shift her weight. A hand would rise as though instinctively reaching for something she didn't need. Her eyes scanning for threats that weren't there. The others took note, some whispering among themselves when they thought she couldn't hear. Was she ex-military? A retired operative? Her actions, her reflexes, suggested something more than a civilian contractor. But she never revealed anything, never offered a hint. She was a puzzle, a quietly intimidating enigma in a sea of ordinary faces. As the days went by, the contractors at Fort Braxton began to wonder about Sarah. How could someone who seemed so ordinary possess such extraordinary control? Why was she so meticulous, so composed, especially in moments where most people would be caught off guard? The mystery around her began to grow. Small moments added up, her constant awareness of the environment, her reactions to loud noises, her posture, which never seemed to waver, no matter the circumstances. It was as though she was waiting, watching, anticipating something, yet no one could understand what that something was. Her behavior didn't match her civilian role. It was more than just the training exercises. It was in the way she stood, the way she walked, even the way she observed the others without ever speaking much. While the others chatted about their weekends or their lives outside the base, Sarah stayed silent, always focused, always in control. It was like she didn't need to participate in these social rituals, as though they were beneath her attention. This quiet isolation only deepened the mystery. Was it a choice? Or was she hiding something more? Something that even she wasn't ready to confront. The more the others observed, the more they started questioning who she really was. There were rumors, of course nothing concrete, just whispers in the hallways. Some thought she was a former Special Forces officer, now working in a civilian capacity. Others speculated that she had once been involved in secret operations, missions too classified to ever be discussed. But no one could confirm anything. Sarah kept her distance, and any attempt to pry further was met with a polite but firm wall of silence. Sarah never went out of her way to correct the rumors. In fact, she didn't seem to care whether anyone believed the stories they spun about. She didn't need to prove anything. She knew who she was, and that was enough. But there were moments, in the quiet spaces between exercises or training, when she would glance over her shoulder, or when her hand would unconsciously rest on the edge of the table, and there was a flicker, a flash of something darker, something deeper. It was as if the mask she wore, the one that made her blend in so effortlessly, was slipping for a split second, revealing something beneath that she couldn't or wouldn't show. The others couldn't see it, but it was there, and that's what made Sarah so compelling. It wasn't just her actions, it was her silence. It was the way she held herself in moments of tension, the way she remained unruffled in the face of uncertainty, always calm, always steady. It was as if she knew something they didn't, and perhaps, just perhaps, she was willing to show them. But for now, the mystery was all they had. The quiet woman at Fort Braxton, the woman who kept to herself but whose every move seemed calculated, was more than anyone could fathom. Her true identity, the one they all wondered about, remained locked away. But it wouldn't stay hidden forever. Time would reveal what they didn't yet know, that Sarah Mitchell was no ordinary woman. She was something else entirely, someone who had been through things that no one could imagine. And eventually, they would see it. They just had to wait for the pieces to fall into place. As the days passed, Sarah's presence at Fort Braxton became increasingly difficult to ignore. Her participation in the training exercises, once just an afterthought, was now the subject of whispers and side glances. Every time Sarah stepped onto the firing range, she moved with precision, handling the M4A1 rifle as though it was an extension of herself. The way she reloaded, aimed, and fired was flawless. Her movements were deliberate, efficient, and strikingly calm, as though she had done this thousands of times before. The instructors, who were used to seeing both civilians and military personnel handle weapons, couldn't help but notice that Sarah's technique was beyond that of an ordinary contractor. She wasn't just participating in the exercises, she was excelling in them. At first, some of the soldiers tried to dismiss it. Perhaps she had some previous experience, they thought, but as Sarah continued to perform at a level that exceeded their expectations, doubt crept in. During the tactical drills, it became even more apparent. While others fumbled through their orders or struggled to keep pace, Sarah reacted with a kind of ease that was almost unsettling. She anticipated movements before they happened, responded to situations with military precision, and always had a plan. Her intuitive understanding of military tactics was uncanny. She handled situations that left others second-guessing with a steady, unfazed resolve. In the chaos of the exercises, Sarah seemed unshakable, as if she had seen it all before. Yet, when asked about her background, she gave little away. The question came up during a casual conversation between contractors after a particularly intense exercise. One of the newer recruits, a young man trying to figure out just who Sarah really was, asked her point blank where she had trained. "I'm sure you must have some military background," he said, as if it were the most natural question to ask. Sarah's response was simple, almost too simple. "I've had some experience." She didn't elaborate, her tone neutral and calm. The silence that followed seemed to stretch far longer than it actually was. The young man, caught off guard by her unhelpful answer, pressed her no further. But the others around him exchanged looks. Their curiosity piqued. Sarah's unwillingness to discuss her past only deepened the mystery. The silence she maintained in the face of questions seemed to hold more weight than any answer she could have given. People speculated endlessly about her origins. Was she a former military officer, a trained operative from some classified operation? There were even whispers of her being a government contractor with ties to covert agencies, but no one knew for sure, and no one could find a way to get her to talk. Her avoidance of social interactions made things even stranger. While the other contractors spent their breaks talking about their lives, sharing jokes, or discussing their past experiences, Sarah kept to herself. She sat in the corner, always watching, always listening, but never participating. It wasn't that she was standoffish. Rather, it was as if she was simply above it all. Her attention was always focused, whether on the exercise at hand or on something the others couldn't see. If anyone tried to approach her, she would offer a polite but firm response, always redirecting the conversation back to the task at hand. It wasn't rudeness, it was a calculated detachment, a way of maintaining her distance while still participating in the world around her. The more the others observed her, the more they began to feel uneasy. She didn't fit the mold of a typical civilian contractor, yet she didn't seem to be anyone of significance either. Her skills were far beyond what would be expected of someone in her position, and that made them uncomfortable. There was an unspoken question hanging in the air. Why was she here? Why was someone so capable, so efficient, so disciplined, working alongside people who, for the most part, were just looking to do their job and move on with their lives? It didn't add up. The soldiers couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah was hiding something. Her calm demeanor, her reluctance to share any details about herself, only fueled their suspicion. It was as though she had a secret she was guarding, one that made her stand apart from the rest. Some of the younger soldiers even started to resent her for it, feeling both awe and frustration. They couldn't place her, couldn't figure out where she fit, and the more they tried, the more they realized they probably never would. One evening, after a particularly grueling set of drills, one of the officers, a seasoned veteran, pulled Sarah aside. He had been watching her for weeks, seeing the way she handled herself in every situation. "You know," he said, his voice low but direct, "you're not like the others." Sarah glanced at him but said nothing. She simply nodded, her gaze steady, betraying nothing. The officer, frustrated by her continued silence, tried again. "I don't know who you really are, but something tells me you've been through a hell of a lot more than you're letting on." Still, Sarah didn't respond. She didn't have to. The officer walked away, shaking his head, as if accepting that there were some things he'd never be able to understand. Her silence, her precision, and the coldness in her responses only made the others more uneasy. They began to talk about her behind her back, wondering if they had a right to know who she truly was. Some of the contractors felt guilty about the curiosity they couldn't shake off. But that didn't stop them from watching her every move. The feeling of being watched was something Sarah seemed to ignore. It was as if she was above it all, not bothered by the growing tension around her. And that, perhaps, was the most unsettling thing of all. Sarah had a strength, a quiet confidence that not only made her an enigma, but a woman who was more than anyone could understand. The growing sense of suspicion, the unease among her colleagues, became impossible to ignore. Sarah was different, and they couldn't figure out why. But that only made them more determined to uncover the truth, even if they couldn't admit it to themselves. The tension was thick in the air now, and as much as Sarah kept her distance, the others were beginning to close in. They would figure her out, one way or another. But until then, she would remain the silent, unshakable force among them, a mystery that couldn't be solved. Sarah sat in the quiet corner of the base, her eyes fixed on the small stack of papers before her. But in her mind, she wasn't at Fort Braxton. She was somewhere far away, lost in memories of a past she had left behind, one that had defined her, but also forced her into the shadows. The faint sound of soldiers training in the distance couldn't drown out the memories of the mission that had changed everything. It had been a routine operation, or at least, that's how they'd been told to see it. She and her team were inserted into a hostile area under the cover of darkness, a mission that was supposed to be just another covert operation. Armed with M4A1 carbines, a weapon she had mastered in countless training sessions, Sarah moved through the dense forest with the others, silent and efficient. Every step was calculated, every movement deliberate. The sense of purpose was clear. A high-value target had been identified, and their job was to neutralize the threat and extract with minimal attention. It should have been a textbook mission, but nothing was ever that simple. In the flash of a second, everything fell apart. The sound of gunfire echoed through the trees, sharp and brutal. Sarah and her team, trained for such chaos, responded quickly, returning fire, coordinating their movements and seeking cover. But then, something changed. There was a break in communication. No one had expected it, but an order came through their comms that didn't match their mission. The decision was made to pull the team back, to leave the target behind. Sarah hesitated for just a moment, but it was long enough. That moment would be the one that haunted her for the rest of her life. Her unit was caught in the crossfire, and the planned extraction didn't come. The enemy forces surrounded them, and within minutes, the situation turned into a massacre. The screams of her fallen comrades still echoed in her mind, each sound a cruel reminder of how everything had gone wrong. The mission classified sensitive, too secretive to be acknowledged, was a failure. But the real betrayal came after that. The system they had trusted, the same system that had sent them into the field, abandoned them. Sarah had survived, but she was left with nothing but memories and guilt. They had told her that her team was lost, that she had been the only survivor. They didn't tell her what they had done to cause it. They didn't tell her how political calculations had turned a mission meant to save lives into a massacre. She had been written off, erased from the records. Her death faked to protect a government that didn't want the truth getting out. The operation was too sensitive, and the powers in charge had made sure it would be buried, hidden in the dark corners of classified files. But Sarah didn't disappear. She couldn't. The guilt of losing her comrades, of being left behind, was too much to bear. So she vanished. She erased herself from every traceable record, becoming a ghost in the system that had once defined her life. She couldn't accept the medals, the recognition. That came after. They didn't deserve her participation, not when they had abandoned her brothers and sisters in arms. The medals were empty, hollow things. She had seen too much, felt too much, to accept anything that came from those lies. In the quiet moments of her day, Sarah would relive it all: the silence before the gunfire, the rush of adrenaline as she fought to stay alive, the faces of her fallen comrades, and the hollow weight of a betrayal that still gnawed at her. She'd seen firsthand what happens when politics overrides the lives of those sent to fight. And it wasn't just the mission that haunted her. It was the faces of the soldiers who died because of decisions made far from the battlefield. Those decisions had cost them everything. And she had to live with the knowledge that the lives lost were treated as acceptable losses by the very people who were supposed to protect them. The memories were still sharp in her mind, even now. The feeling of the A-10 aircraft flying overhead, its rumbling sound echoing in the distance, brought it all back. She had worked with such aircraft before, in the thick of operations where every second counted. But even the roar of the jets, meant to offer protection, reminded her of how vulnerable they had all been. The mission had gone wrong from the moment they had been ordered to leave the target behind, and everything after that felt like a blur of betrayal and survival. As Sarah sat there, alone in the corner of the base. She could still hear the voices of the fallen, calling to her from the darkness. They had never been honored, their sacrifices buried beneath the weight of bureaucracy and lies. But Sarah would never forget them. They were her brothers and sisters, and they deserved to be remembered. The life she had chosen, this new, quiet existence, wasn't about forgetting them. It was about protecting the truth, even if it meant living in the shadows. The weight of their deaths pressed down on her every day, and the anger she felt toward the military leadership that had betrayed them never faded. The political games played with the lives of soldiers were not just wrong, they were unforgivable. Sarah had no place in their world anymore, not with the secrets she knew and the bitterness she carried. But there was still something she could do. She could teach the next generation of soldiers the truth that came from experience, from surviving the things no one wanted to acknowledge. She wouldn't let them be fooled by the polished speeches or the medals. She would teach them to understand what real service meant and how easily it could be corrupted. Her past had shaped her, but it didn't define her. Not anymore. Sarah was determined to keep moving forward, even if it meant carrying the weight of her fallen comrades with her. They deserved more than to be forgotten, and if she had to carry their memory alone, she would, because the truth mattered more than anything else. Colonel Marcus Webb stood at the front of the room, his broad shoulders squared and his expression as rigid as the military, traditions he held so dearly. With over 3 decades of service under his belt, Webb had risen through the ranks by embodying the strict, unwavering structure that military life demanded. To him, rank was everything, and officers' respect and authority were defined by their position. In his eyes, the hierarchy was sacred, an unyielding foundation of discipline that separated those who earned respect from those who needed to prove themselves. He believed in conformity, in the rigid adherence to rules that ensured order, and he didn't tolerate challenges to this system, especially from outsiders. Sarah Mitchell, with her quiet defiance and her refusal to follow the expected norms, was an immediate threat to everything he stood for. From the moment Sarah had refused to salute during the graduation ceremony, Colonel Webb had seen her as a direct challenge to his authority, though she had never directly confronted him. Her actions were a silent protest, and that was enough to set him on edge. In his mind, Sarah was not just breaking a small, inconsequential rule, she was undermining the entire framework that made the military function. To Colonel Webb, respect was a command, not a choice, and anyone who failed to demonstrate it was an enemy of the structure. And so, he set out to remind Sarah both publicly and privately of the consequences of not respecting the system. At first, it was subtle. During briefings, Webb would call on Sarah, using her as an example of what not to do. When she responded in the same measured, unemotional tone that she always used, Webb would twist her words, questioning her professionalism and dismissing her responses as unsatisfactory. The soldiers in the room noticed, but they said nothing, unsure whether Sarah's silence was a refusal to engage or a calm acknowledgement of Webb's position. Regardless, Sarah remained unmoved. The more Webb pressed, the more she withdrew into herself, offering no explanations, no defense. Her lack of response only made him more determined to break her composure. As the days wore on, Colonel Webb's tactics grew more aggressive. He began assigning Sarah the most menial, tedious tasks, ones he would never ask of someone with her supposed level of expertise. He deliberately placed her in situations where her skills would be underappreciated, forcing her to handle duties like filing paperwork or cleaning equipment tasks that were far below her abilities. Webb's actions were a clear attempt to demoralize her, to show her and everyone else who was in charge. He wanted to break her spirit, to make her conform, but Sarah remained unfazed. She did what was asked of her without complaint, her performance impeccable, but always distant, always separate from the games Webb was playing. The tension between them began to build. Webb's humiliation of Sarah was no longer confined to private exchanges. He began to make his criticisms public, loudly questioning her loyalty and commitment to the mission. In front of the other contractors, he would accuse her of not taking her position seriously, of not understanding the importance of following orders. His voice would rise, cutting through the quiet of the room, always directed at Sarah, always aimed at her inability to follow what he considered the basic rules of military life. And every time, Sarah stood there, silent, her expression calm, giving him nothing to latch onto. It was infuriating to Webb. He was used to breaking people, used to intimidating them into submission. But Sarah resisted. The more she resisted, the more he came to believe she was deliberately defying him. Other soldiers began to notice the growing hostility, and many began to distance themselves from Sarah, Webb had created an atmosphere of suspicion, where associating with her was seen as an act of rebellion. It wasn't just that she wasn't playing by the rules. It was that her very presence was a challenge to those who believed in the military system Webb upheld. The whispers among the contractors became louder, some speculating whether Sarah's actions were a deliberate attempt to undermine authority. But no one dared to speak to her directly about it. Instead, they watched from the sidelines, torn between respect for Sarah's calm demeanor and fear of Webb's escalating aggression. Webb was not one to back down, and the pressure he exerted on Sarah only increased. He began to corner her in front of the others, questioning her background, her experience, and her intentions. "You're here as a civilian contractor, not as some special agent," he would say, his voice sharp. "So stop acting like you belong with the rest of us." He challenged her every move, every glance, every word. He wanted her to break, to defend herself, to explain why she was different. But Sarah didn't engage. She continued to respond with the same dispassionate calm, her face unreadable, her voice steady. She offered no apology for her behavior and no justification for her refusal to conform. The more Sarah maintained her silence, the more Webb felt his control slipping. His attempts to humiliate her were failing. The other soldiers might have been intimidated by his rank and authority, but Sarah was not. This only served to fuel his rage, turning their dynamic into a battle of wills. Webb's obsession with breaking Sarah became all-consuming. He believed that by publicly attacking her, by forcing her to bend, he could restore the order he so desperately clung to. He couldn't stand the idea that someone, especially someone like Sarah, was defying the basic rules of military respect. Sarah's refusal to defend herself became the focal point of Webb's increasing hostility. It was as if her silence, her detachment, was the ultimate challenge to his sense of control. Every time she didn't react the way he expected, his frustration mounted. He began questioning her actions in front of everyone. "What's the point of having someone like you here if you can't even follow the simplest of commands?" he would bark, trying to provoke some sort of emotional reaction from her. But she stood there, unshaken, unwavering, her gaze fixed on something far beyond the confines of the training room. Colonel Webb's behavior escalated to the point where others began to feel the tension in the air. The more he pushed Sarah, the more the others saw how he was using his position to break her down, to make her submit to his will. Yet Sarah remained the same, silent, controlled, and calm. It wasn't weakness. It was something else entirely. Something Webb couldn't understand. And the longer he tried to force her into submission, the more the truth became clear. It wasn't Sarah who needed to change. It was Webb. His rigid belief in military hierarchy and his inability to understand Sarah's quiet defiance were the true weaknesses on display. The tension was building, and everyone knew it. The gap between Sarah and Webb was widening, not just between them, but between what Sarah represented: freedom, independence, and the courage to stand firm in what Webb symbolized: blind obedience, respect by rank, and an iron fist. Sarah's refusal to engage in his game of authority only made her more formidable, and the harder Webb pushed, the more obvious it became that he couldn't win this fight. The pressure was mounting, and neither of them was ready for what would come next. The memorial ceremony at Fort Braxton was meant to be a somber, respectful moment for honoring those who had fallen in service to their country. Soldiers stood in formation, some saluting, others with their heads bowed in silence. A hush fell over the crowd as the commanding officer read the names of the fallen, each one marked with a brief description of their sacrifices. Yet, despite the solemnity of the event, Sarah stood still, her expression unreadable, her gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the ceremony. She didn't flinch when the names of those who had died in combat were read aloud. She had her own ghosts to carry. But it was during that moment, as the crowd remained in their silent reverence, that something unexpected happened. General Harrison, a weathered man with a sharp eye for detail, found his gaze drifting toward Sarah. There was something about her, a quiet intensity that pulled his attention. He had seen it before, but the realization hit him slowly, almost imperceptibly. Sarah's demeanor, the way she stood so still, the way her eyes never left the horizon. He had seen that exact posture in classified briefings, in operations far more dangerous than anyone here could comprehend. The recognition wasn't immediate, but it was enough to make him pause. His thoughts raced back to the many files he had seen, some of which were so secret they could not be accessed without multiple layers of security clearance. Among those files, there was one name, one face, that had always been redacted, marked with the cryptic label "Dead Operation Closed." He had assumed, like everyone else, that Sarah's file was simply one of the many untraceable casualties in covert operations. But as he stood there, watching her, he realized something had always seemed off about that assessment. Sarah wasn't just another civilian contractor. She was someone far more significant. A sense of urgency gripped him. Without drawing attention to himself, General Harrison discreetly stepped to the side, pulling out his phone and opening a secure military database. His fingers moved quickly, tapping through encrypted layers of data as he accessed files that had been buried deep within the system. He didn't need much time, just a few taps, a few seconds, and there it was. Sarah Mitchell. Her name was no longer redacted, no longer a mystery. The records detailed an 18-year career with the intelligence community, one that stretched across a series of highly classified missions spanning nearly 2 decades. She had been a part of operations so secretive that not even her death had been allowed to be publicly acknowledged. Instead, a fabricated story had been created to shield the government from the uncomfortable truth about what had really happened during that mission. She had disappeared, erased from the system, so that the real story would never come to light. General Harrison's heart pounded in his chest as he read through the information. Sarah Mitchell wasn't just a civilian. She was a decorated intelligence officer, a survivor of one of the most dangerous and covert operations ever undertaken by the U.S. military. She had been part of missions in hostile territories, protecting national security interests at a level most would never comprehend. And yet, she had been left behind, her name wiped from existence, her sacrifices ignored by those who had sent her into the fire. The realization struck him like a blow. The woman standing before him, the one whose stoic demeanor had frustrated Colonel Webb and puzzled everyone else, was a hero, a true hero. But her heroism had been buried under layers of bureaucracy and lies. She had been discarded, her story lost to time. And now, standing in front of him, she was nothing more than a ghost of the past, trying to live a life beyond the shadow of the secrets she carried. The truth of who Sarah really was began to weigh heavily on him. The quiet woman who had drawn so much suspicion, so much animosity, was someone who had faced horrors none of them could imagine. Her silence was not one of guilt or shame, it was one of survival. She had chosen to disappear to protect the truth, to shield the country from the consequences of those who had failed her and her comrades. It wasn't just the betrayal of her unit that haunted her. It was the betrayal by the very people who had sent her to fight and then erased her from their records when they no longer needed her. Suddenly, the weight of the ceremony, the memorial that was supposed to honor those who had fallen, felt hollow. How many stories like Sarah's were hidden beneath the surface? How many men and women had given their all, only to be forgotten by the very system they served? General Harrison's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the ceremony moving forward. But the truth about Sarah Mitchell gnawed at him. Without a word, he walked forward, cutting through the crowd and stepping toward Sarah. The murmur of voices died down as the general made his way to the front, where she stood, unfazed by the growing attention. The moment was surreal. The eyes of every soldier now locked on them, wondering what would happen next. General Harrison stopped in front of Sarah, his face now fully understanding. He looked at her for a moment, almost as if searching for some sign of acknowledgement, before he spoke. "Agent Mitchell," he said, his voice steady but laced with a new respect. "Please step forward." The words hit the crowd like a shockwave. Gasps echoed through the room as the general used a title that no one had expected to hear. Agent Mitchell, the title alone revealed the truth of who she was. The soldiers, once so certain of Sarah's inferiority, now found themselves frozen in disbelief. Sarah's face remained calm as ever, but there was a slight shift in her posture. She didn't look startled. She didn't even look surprised. It was as though she had known this moment would come, and she was prepared to face it. Slowly, she stepped forward, her boots clicking against the floor. The atmosphere in the room thickened, the tension palpable. General Harrison addressed the room, his voice carrying over the stunned silence. "Sarah Mitchell is not just a civilian contractor. She is a decorated intelligence officer, with 18 years of service in some of the most classified and dangerous operations this country has ever seen. She was part of missions that prevented wars, saved countless lives, and sacrificed everything for national security." The words fell over the soldiers like a heavy blanket. They had known Sarah as someone who barely spoke, who kept to herself and refused to engage with them. They had seen her as an outsider, someone to be scrutinized, questioned, and even humiliated. But now, they were forced to reckon with the truth that Sarah was a war hero, not just in the traditional sense, but in a way none of them could truly understand. General Harrison continued, his voice full of gravity. "Her death was fabricated to protect the sensitive nature of her operations. And those of you who've spent the past weeks questioning her commitment and loyalty know this. She has given more for this country than any of you could possibly comprehend. The room was silent, the weight of the revelation settling over them like a thick fog. For the first time, the soldiers saw Sarah not as the mysterious outsider, but as a figure of immense respect. Her stoic nature, once a source of confusion and frustration, now seemed to radiate a quiet dignity. The entire room began to stand, first one soldier, then another, until everyone was at attention, acknowledging the truth they had never known. For Sarah, the moment wasn't about recognition or applause. She had never sought that. It was about truth, a truth that had been buried for far too long. As she stood there, unflinching, the crowd's respect didn't matter. What mattered was that the past had been unveiled, and the men and women who had never been acknowledged were finally seen for who they were. This moment would change everything. After her true identity was revealed, Sarah Mitchell's life at Fort Braxton took on a new purpose. No longer just a quiet contractor, Sarah was now a respected figure, though not in the way one might expect. She wasn't interested in accolades or recognition. The medals and honors that had been offered to her throughout her service meant little to her now. Instead, Sarah's focus was on the future, on shaping the next generation of officers who would inherit the complex world she had lived in. She was determined to teach them the lessons she had learned in the field, the lessons that had never been written in any textbook. Her first class was a small group of young officers, all eager to prove themselves, all ready to learn what Sarah had to offer. As they sat in the room, their eyes full of expectation, they quickly realized that Sarah's approach was far different from anything they had encountered before. Her teaching style wasn't focused on drill and ceremony, nor was it filled with the usual patriotic rhetoric they had grown up hearing. Sarah's lessons were raw, real, and unflinchingly honest. She didn't talk about glory or heroism in the traditional sense. Instead, she talked about the human cost of war, the lives lost, the families shattered, the quiet burdens carried by those who survived. Her first lecture was on the dangers of unquestioning loyalty to the military system. She told her students that loyalty was vital, but that loyalty without understanding could be dangerous. In her own experience, she had seen how blind obedience to authority had led to death, both in battle and in the hidden political machinations that shaped their missions. She didn't sugarcoat the realities of military life. She talked about how soldiers were often sent into harm's way based on decisions made far away from the battlefield, decisions driven by politics, not by the needs of the people fighting the wars. Her words were sharp, unsettling even, but they were the truth. At first, her students were taken aback by her bluntness. They had been trained to follow orders, to respect the chain of command, and to hold fast to the ideals of duty and patriotism. Sarah's approach challenged everything they had been taught. They were uncomfortable with her honesty, unsure of how to respond to the stark realities she laid before them. But as her lectures continued, they began to understand. Slowly, they realized that Sarah wasn't attacking the military or the values they held dear. She was simply asking them to think critically, to question the decisions they would one day make as leaders. She wanted them to understand the weight of the decisions they would face, to know that every choice could have a cost that wasn't immediately visible. One of Sarah's most powerful lessons came during a discussion on the morality of war. She shared a story with them, a story of a mission she had been a part of, one that had gone wrong. It wasn't just about the tactical failures or the loss of life. It was about the decision that had been made, the choice to send them in despite the risks, all in the name of political expediency. Her voice softened as she spoke about the men and women who had died in that mission, people who had been written off as expendable because of the political realities of the operation. She talked about the survivor's guilt she carried with her every day. Her students listened in rapt attention, the weight of her words sinking in. They had never been asked to think about war in such personal terms before. As the weeks passed, Sarah's classes began to have a noticeable impact on the cadets. They started to ask more difficult questions, to challenge the assumptions they had always accepted without thinking. They no longer saw military service as a simple matter of duty or following orders. They understood that service was complex and that sometimes doing the right thing meant going against the very system they had been taught to respect. Sarah's teachings didn't just make them better officers, they made them better people. They began to realize that integrity wasn't just about following orders. It was about doing the right thing, even when it wasn't the easy thing. Despite the pushback she received from some of the higher-ups at Fort Braxton, Sarah's presence began to change the way military training was conducted. Officers who had once adhered strictly to the old way of training started to adopt some of her methods. They began to see the value in teaching their cadets about the moral complexities of warfare. They started to understand that the next generation of officers needed more than just technical skills. They needed the wisdom to navigate the gray areas of leadership, to understand that every mission had a human cost. But it wasn't just the students who changed. Sarah herself began to feel something shift within her. As she taught her classes, as she watched the young officers grow, she found herself coming to terms with the ghosts of her past. The more she spoke about the importance of truth, of recognizing the costs of war, the more she understood that the work she was doing now was the real service she had been meant for all along. It wasn't the medals or the recognition that mattered anymore. It was the opportunity to shape the future, to ensure that the mistakes of the past were not repeated. One day, during a particularly emotional lecture, Sarah was interrupted by a student who asked a question that cut straight to the heart of everything she had been teaching. "How do we know when we're doing the right thing?" he asked, his voice trembling. The room fell silent. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, her eyes softening. "You don't," she said quietly. "But you always have to ask yourself if the decision you're making is something you can live with. If you can look yourself in the mirror and know you did what was right, even if it cost you everything, then you'll know." Those words became the core of her teachings. It wasn't about victory or accolades. It was about understanding that leadership meant taking responsibility, not just for the successes, but for the failures as well. It meant accepting that sometimes, even the best-intentioned decisions had consequences that no one could predict. And it meant that those who wore the uniform had to carry the weight of those consequences every day. Sarah's legacy, slowly but surely, began to take root at Fort Braxton. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was real. The changes she inspired in her students didn't happen overnight, but they were lasting. The next generation of officers wasn't just trained in tactics and strategy. They were trained to think, to question, and to understand that true leadership was about more than just following orders. It was about integrity, responsibility, and the willingness to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. Sarah had taught them to honor the truth above all else, and in doing so, she had ensured that the mistakes of the past would never be forgotten. Her influence would echo through their careers, shaping the future of the military for years to come. Sarah Mitchell had never asked for fame, never wanted recognition, but through her quiet strength and unwavering dedication to the truth, she had created a legacy that would outlast any medal or decoration. She had changed the course of military training, one officer at a time, by teaching them the most important lesson of all, that the true cost of service is not just measured in battles won, but in the integrity of the choices made along the way. The morning at Arlington National Cemetery was quiet, the kind of stillness that only a place of remembrance could hold. The air was crisp, and the sky stretched in soft hues of early morning blue. Sarah Mitchell stood alone, her figure small against the vast expanse of the cemetery, the weight of the moment pressing down on her as she walked slowly towards the corner of the grounds, away from the crowds and the grand memorials. She had come here for a different reason, to visit a place no one else knew existed, a place that held no name, no grand inscription. It was a private memorial, simple and unmarked, standing in stark contrast to the elaborate gravestones around it. Her steps were measured, slow, as if the ground beneath her carried the weight of all she had lived through. She had visited this place countless times before, always in silence, always alone. There were no plaques here, no words to be read, only the small stone markers that barely stood out against the green grass. It was a space built for those who had never been remembered by the system, for those who had been lost in the shadows of political decisions, sacrificed for expedience rather than honor. Sarah had made sure it was a place of peace, not a public spectacle, because that was how she believed it should be. The men and women buried here had given everything, and they deserved this quiet solitude. As she knelt down before the memorial, Sarah pulled out a small bundle of fresh flowers from the bag at her side. She placed them carefully, each stem a gesture of respect for the comrades she had lost. She didn't need to speak their names, she knew them. Each face, each story. Their sacrifice had never been acknowledged in any official capacity, and for a long time, that had weighed heavily on her heart. But now, after all the years of fighting to bury the truth, she had come to terms with it. Her peace did not lie in the recognition of others, but in this private act of remembrance. No medals, no parades, no public applause could ever compare to the quiet dignity of remembering them. Here, in a place that had never been tainted by bureaucracy or political expedience. Sarah's eyes lingered on the memorial for a long time. She thought back to the mission that had cost so many lives, the mission where everything had gone wrong, They had been sent into the field with a purpose, a noble cause that had been turned into a casualty of shifting political interests. They had fought bravely, done their jobs with the kind of courage and dedication that anyone in uniform would recognize, but in the end, they had been abandoned. The system had left them, just as it had left her. Her survival had been a cruel reminder of the failure of the people who had sent them into harm's way, and the guilt she carried for having lived while so many others had died had haunted her ever since. But today, as she knelt there, she felt a small measure of release. They were gone, but they had not been forgotten, not by her, and not by this simple memorial. The quiet strength of the moment settled over her. Sarah wasn't someone who sought validation, and she had long ago stopped needing it. The ceremony, the speeches, the grand gestures, they weren't what mattered. What mattered was this, the quiet act of placing flowers, of honoring those who had been forgotten by the system, of keeping their memory alive in a way that didn't require the world to know. She had done her part. She had fought. She had survived. And now she could honor her comrades in her own way, on her own terms. The world might not ever understand the depth of her sacrifice or the sacrifices of the people she had lost, but here, in this place, the truth was undeniable. As Sarah stood up and took a final moment to look at the simple markers, she felt a calmness wash over her. The anger, the bitterness, the frustration, those had all been necessary emotions in her journey. But now, they were less important. What mattered now was the lesson she had learned over the years that true service wasn't about recognition, wasn't about medals or public acclaim. It was about integrity, about doing the right thing even when no one was watching, even when no one cared. The real honor was in standing firm, in remembering, and in living a life that reflected the values you held closest, regardless of whether the world acknowledged them. With a final glance at the memorial, Sarah took a slow step back. Her journey here had come full circle. She had carried the burden of her fallen comrades for so long. But now, she was ready to leave it behind, not to forget, but to let go. The lessons they had taught her, the strength they had shown, would stay with her forever, woven into the fabric of everything she did from this point forward. She had given them the only thing she could, her quiet respect, her private tribute, and it was enough. As she turned to leave the cemetery, the weight of the past lifted slightly, replaced by a sense of peace that had long eluded her. Sarah Mitchell had never sought the spotlight, never needed to be recognized for her actions. But in this final act, in this quiet moment of reflection and remembrance, she had fulfilled the promise she had made to those who had fallen. Their story would live on, not in the annals of military history, but in the hearts of those who remembered them. And as Sarah walked away, her steps slow and measured, she knew that her legacy, too, would be defined by her commitment to the truth, to those who had been forgotten, and to the quiet strength that had carried her through it all.